This is a story from my life, though it feels like a lifetime ago. It's the kind of truth you keep locked away, but the weight of it eventually breaks the door down. It's about family, betrayal, and the quiet, terrible joy of building an empire on the ruins of the people who tried to bury you. The mahogany of the boardroom table felt as cold as a tombstone under my fingertips. It was the same table my great-grandfather had built, the centerpiece of Vance & Sons heritage, a company whose legacy was supposed to be my birthright. My father, Alistair Vance, sat at the head, his face a mask of patriarchal indifference. My brother Leo sat to his right, a smug, coiled snake in a bespoke suit. I was there to present the future, a detailed, painstakingly researched proposal to bring our 100-year-old custom furniture business into the digital age. I cleared my throat, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and old familiar fear. But before I could speak the first word, my father slid a single, crisp sheet of paper across the polished surface. It stopped directly in front of me. With a casual flick of his wrist, he said, "Your services are no longer required, Clara. Leo will be handling the modernization. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows." The silence that followed was absolute. The words didn't compute. My proposal, my life's work, sat in a leather-bound folio in front of me, unopened. The termination letter, by contrast, felt like it was screaming. I looked from my father's stony expression to my brother's. A slow, triumphant smirk was spreading across Leo's face. He had the same dark hair as our father, the same sharp jawline, but where my father's eyes were cold and calculating, Leo's were filled with a petty, gleeful cruelty. I was the one who had spent my childhood in the workshop, the smell of sawdust and varnish imprinted on my soul. I was the one who learned the art of the dovetail joint from my grandfather, his gnarled hands guiding my own. I was the one who went to business school, who stayed up nights studying market trends and supply chain logistics, while Leo was out cultivating his Charleston socialite persona, securing his place as the heir apparent through charm and manipulation. For 5 years, I had been the COO in everything but name, managing the craftsmen, streamlining production, and quietly cleaning up Leo's expensive mistakes. He was the vice president of brand image, a title that meant long lunches at Hall's Chop House and schmoozing at the Carolina Yacht Club. I was the engine. He was the polished hood ornament. This proposal was meant to be my moment, the culmination of a year of secret, feverish work. The Vance Digital Bespoke platform would allow clients to custom design furniture online using our proprietary styles and materials, with a VR visualization tool. It would open us up to a national market, tripling our revenue within 3 years. It was revolutionary for an industry still stuck in the age of paper catalogs and faxed orders. I had poured everything into it, convinced that its sheer brilliance would finally force my father to see me, to acknowledge my value beyond being the dutiful, background daughter. What is this?" I finally managed, my voice a strangled whisper. "It's a severance agreement, Clara," my father said, his tone flat, as if discussing the weather. "A generous one, I might add. It includes a standard non-disclosure and a non-compete clause. Our lawyers at Hainsworth Sinclair Boyd have already reviewed it." "You're firing me?" The words felt absurd, alien in my mouth. "But, my proposal. You haven't even seen it." That's when Leo picked up the identical leather-bound folio next to him. He opened it, revealing my title page, my meticulously crafted executive summary. Except at the bottom, where my name should have been, was his, Leo Vance, VP of Brand Image. "Oh, but we have seen it, sis," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And I've got to hand it to you, it's a fantastic starting point. A little rough around the edges, but the core idea has potential. Once I refine it, of course." The blood drained from my face. They hadn't just rejected my idea. They had stolen it. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the magnitude of their betrayal. I thought of the late nights, the skipped weekends, the passion I had poured into every slide, every financial projection. I had shared my progress with Leo a month ago, naively believing he was offering constructive feedback, that he was finally ready to be a partner. Instead, he had been a spy, You can't do this, I said, looking at my father, searching for any flicker of the man who had once read me bedtime stories. I found nothing but polished granite. This is my work, my intellectual property. A dry, humorless chuckle escaped his lips. Everything you created while an employee of this company belongs to this company. You signed that in your employment contract 20 years ago. As of this morning, you are no longer an employee. You have 1 hour to clear out your personal effects. Security will escort you. He stood up, straightening his tie, the universal signal for a concluded meeting. Leo, walk me through the Q3 projections. They were already moving on, dismissing my entire existence as easily as swatting a fly. My life, my career, my family, all gone in the space of 30 seconds. As I sat there, paralyzed, Leo leaned over and plucked the proposal from my hands. He gave me a wink, a final, sharp twist of the knife. Thanks for the legwork, sis. We'll take it from here. The hour they gave me was the most humiliating of my life. A stoic security guard named Frank, who had known me since I was a little girl running through the workshop, stood with his arms crossed by my office door, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, unable to meet my gaze. My office, a small space I had personalized with photos of my grandfather and me, with samples and design sketches, suddenly felt like a foreign country. I moved in a daze, packing my belongings into a single pathetic cardboard box. My colleagues, people I'd worked with for years, scurried past my door, their heads down, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. No one dared to speak to me. A memo had already circulated. Clara Vance has resigned to pursue other opportunities, effective immediately. The lie was so blatant, so insulting, it was almost elegant in its cruelty. The severance check was a joke, 3 months' salary for 2 decades of my life. It was just enough to make a legal challenge prohibitively expensive. They knew that. The non-compete was ironclad, preventing me from working in high-end custom furniture design, anywhere in the Carolinas for 2 years. They hadn't just fired me, they had salted the earth. I drove away from the historic Vance & Sons building on King Street, the familiar, ornate sign feeling like a personal insult, and I didn't know where to go. My small apartment in the French Quarter was paid for by my salary, a salary that no longer existed. My world had been Vance & Sons. My identity was tied up in the scent of cedar and the sheen of lacquer. Without it, I was nothing. The first few weeks were a blur of shame and rage. I tried to call my father, to appeal to some long-dormant sense of decency. His secretary politely informed me he was in conference every time I called. Leo simply blocked my number. The Charleston business community is small and insular. Old families stick together. I started looking for work in related fields, interior design, architectural consulting, but doors that should have been open were slammed shut in my face. I'd have a great interview, a palpable connection with the hiring manager, and then silence. After the 3rd time, I finally got a sympathetic call back from a woman at a design firm I knew socially. "Off the record, Clara," she whispered into the phone. "Your father called our CEO. He said you were emotionally volatile. A brilliant mind, but unstable. A risk. Unstable. Volatile." They were painting me as the crazy, bitter woman, a narrative as old as time. They weren't just content with stealing my work. They were systematically destroying my reputation to ensure I could never become a threat. The severance money was dwindling fast. Panic began to set in, a cold, creeping dread that settled in my stomach. To cut costs, I gave up my apartment and moved into a tiny, rundown rental on James Island, a world away from the historic grandeur I was used to. I started selling off my jewelry, my nice clothes, anything of value, just to make rent and buy groceries. The humiliation was a constant, physical weight. One rainy Tuesday, staring at a stack of bills I couldn't pay, I decided to apply for a small business loan to start something, anything on my own. To do that, I needed all my financial records. I spent the afternoon digging through old file boxes, pulling out years of bank statements and tax returns. That's when I saw it. It was small, almost insignificant, a discrepancy in my profit-sharing statement from 3 years prior. The company had a great year, but my payout seemed low. I had questioned it at the time, but Leo had waved it off as creative accounting, to minimize the tax burden for everyone. "Trust me, sis, it's for the best," he'd said with that slick, reassuring smile. Now, looking at the numbers, a sliver of suspicion cut through my despair. I started pulling out all the old statements, lining them up, year after year. The pattern was undeniable. In lean years, my percentage was correct. In boom years, it was consistently, inexplicably lower than it should have been. It wasn't a mistake. It was a strategy. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but my gut told me something was deeply wrong. I remembered Arthur Pembroke, the company's head accountant who had retired 2 years ago. He was a quiet, meticulous man who had been with the company since my grandfather's time. He'd always had a soft spot for me, often lamenting how my father overlooked my contributions. Arthur was old school, a man of integrity. If anyone knew the truth, it was him. My hands were trembling as I found his number in my old contacts. I dialed, half expecting him not to answer. He picked up on the third ring. "Arthur," I said, my voice unsteady. "It's Clara Vance." There was a pause on the line. When he spoke, his voice was strained, heavy with a nervousness that confirmed my fears. "Clara, I was wondering when you might call." I told him what I'd found, the discrepancies, Leo's explanation. He was silent for a long moment. Finally, he sighed, a weary, defeated sound. "Meet me tomorrow. Noon. The Lost Dog Cafe on Folly Beach. Come alone." The line went dead. My heart hammered in my chest. What had he meant by that? A new, more terrifying thought began to form in my mind. The betrayal I knew was just the tip of the iceberg. As I looked out my window at the rain-slicked street, I had the sickening feeling I was about to find out just how deep the rot in my family went. The salt-laced air of Folly Beach did little to calm the storm raging inside me. The Lost Dog Cafe was a world away from the polished mahogany and hushed tones of my old life. It was loud, sandy, and gloriously unpretentious. I saw Arthur in a corner booth, hunched over a cup of coffee, looking older and more frail than I remembered. He'd lost weight, and the skin around his eyes was dark with worry. As I slid into the seat opposite him, he flinched, his gaze darting around the crowded cafe, as if he expected my father's ghost to materialize beside me. "Thank you for meeting me, Arthur." I began, but he cut me off, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "They destroyed my pension, Clara." The words hung in the air between us, raw and bitter. 40 years I gave that company. When I retired, Alistair told me there had been a shortfall, an investment that went sour. He said the pension fund was nearly wiped out. He gave me a fraction of what I was owed, made me sign an NDA, and told me I was lucky to get that. My stomach clenched. This was worse than I thought. "That's not possible," I whispered. "The fund was protected, invested conservatively." Arthur let out a hollow laugh. "Protected from the outside world, maybe. Not from the inside. Not from them." He leaned closer, his eyes pleading for me to understand. "What you found in your statements, that wasn't just shaving off a few points for tax purposes. That was the start of it. For the last 15 years, your father and Leo have been running a shadow ledger. They've been systematically deflating the company's declared profits, funneling the real money, millions of dollars, Clara, into a series of offshore shell corporations and a private trust fund. A fund that lists only one beneficiary, Leo." The coffee cup in my hand trembled. I felt a wave of nausea, so intense I had to grip the edge of the table. It wasn't just my job they'd stolen. It wasn't just my idea. They had been stealing from me, from the employees, from the very foundation of the company my grandfather built, for my entire adult life. My inheritance, the profit sharing I was owed, Arthur's pension, it had all been siphoned away to enrich Leo, the golden son, while I was left to fight for scraps. "How?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "It was brilliant in its own way," Arthur admitted, a hint of grudging respect in his tone. "Inflated invoices from suppliers who kicked back cash. Undervaluing finished inventory. Writing off custom projects for high-profile clients as marketing expenses while the clients paid them personally under the table. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. Impossible to spot unless you knew exactly where to look. He slid a small, tarnished brass key across the table. I knew this day might come. I couldn't go to the authorities. Alistair has judges and politicians in his pocket. He would have ruined me. But I couldn't let it go either. I made copies. Of everything. The real ledgers, the offshore transfer receipts, the secret trust documents. They're in a storage unit at a facility off I-26. Unit 312. This is the only key. I stared at the key, a small, cold piece of metal that held the power to either destroy my family or destroy me. As I sat there, trying to process the sheer scale of their depravity, my phone buzzed with a news alert from the Charleston Post and Courier. The headline felt like a physical blow. Vance & Sons announces landmark digital expansion, headed by Leo Vance. The article was nauseatingly effusive, featuring a photo of my father and brother standing in the showroom, beaming. My father was quoted praising Leo's unparalleled vision and innate understanding of the luxury market. They were celebrating on the grave of my career, using my stolen dream as their pedestal. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. That night, my rage gave way to a chilling clarity. I drove to the storage facility, the key feeling heavy in my hand. The unit was small, dusty, and filled with a dozen bankers' boxes. I opened the first one. Inside, meticulously organized, were the real financial records of Vance & Sons. It was all there. Every fraudulent transaction, every stolen dollar. The proof. As I stood there under the flickering fluorescent light, I got an email notification. It was from a legal courier. Attached was a cease and desist letter from Hainsworth Sinclair Boyd, their corporate pit bulls. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, formally demanding that I refrain from using the Vance name professionally in any capacity, and forbidding me from producing any furniture based on designs I had developed while at the company. Designs that were exclusively mine, born from my own creativity. That was the moment the last shred of grief and sorrow in me died, replaced by something cold, hard, and diamond-sharp. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted me erased. They wanted to strip me of my work, my reputation, my very name. They believed they were untouchable, gods in their own little Charleston kingdom, capable of writing me out of existence with the stroke of a pen. Standing in that dusty storage unit, surrounded by the evidence of their crimes, a new purpose took root in my soul. I wasn't going to fight for my old job. I wasn't going to sue for a better severance. I was going to build something new, something better, something so powerful it would cast a shadow over their crumbling legacy. They thought they had buried me, but they'd made a fatal mistake. They'd buried a seed, and I was going to build my new world on their ashes. A low whisper escaped my lips, a vow made to the dusty air. Let's go to war. War isn't declared with trumpets, it begins in silence. My first move was not to hire a lawyer, but to build an army. My father and Leo saw their craftsmen as labor, replaceable cogs in their machine. I saw them as artists, the soul of the company. My first visit was to Miguel Diaz, the master finisher whose hands could make a piece of cherry would sing. My father had forced him into a meager retirement 6 months earlier, replacing him with a cheaper, less skilled team to cut costs. I found him in his small garage workshop in West Ashley, a place that smelled of linseed oil and regret. He was restoring an old rocking chair, his movements still precise, still filled with a lifetime of love for the craft. I didn't offer him a job. I offered him a partnership. I laid out my plan, my vision for a new kind of company, one built on respect and shared ownership. I showed him the designs they had forbidden me from using. A slow fire ignited in his tired eyes. Alistair has no soul for the wood, he said, running a hand over the chair's smooth curve. His son has even less. They see only money. We see life. He was my first soldier. Next was Sarah Jenkins, a brilliant young woman with a degree in engineering who was a prodigy with CNC machines and 3D modeling. Leo had relentlessly mocked her, calling her shop-class Barbie, and had relegated her to running diagnostics while less talented men were promoted. She was hungry, angry, and smarter than anyone in my family's company. I offered her a stake and full creative control over our technology. She quit Vance & Sons the next day. One by one, I gathered the forgotten ones, the undervalued, the disrespected. A master upholsterer, a brilliant woodturner, a logistics expert Leo had fired over a personal grudge. My army wasn't built on payrolls. It was forged from shared resentment and a burning desire to prove our worth. With my savings drained, I sold my car and the last of my grandmother's jewelry. It was enough to lease a small, grimy warehouse in an industrial park in North Charleston, a place that reeked of diesel fumes and ambition. We scrubbed the concrete floors on our hands and knees, wired our own electrical, and bought second-hand equipment at auctions. It was a world away from the historic, ivy-covered Vance & Sons building, but it was ours. We needed a name. Using Vance was legally impossible and personally repugnant. We settled on acanthus and oak. The acanthus leaf, a symbol of enduring life and rebirth in classical carving, and oak, the symbol of strength and integrity. It was a promise. It was our standard. While we toiled in obscurity, Vance & Sons launched their Vance Digital Bespoke platform with a lavish party covered by every local magazine. It was a disaster. It was a clunky, outsourced imitation of my vision, plagued with bugs and offering sterile, uninspired designs. The reviews were tepid, criticizing the lack of soul and the exorbitant prices. They had stolen the recipe, but had none of the right ingredients. Meanwhile, acanthus and oak began its quiet insurgency. We didn't advertise. We started with a single, perfect commission, a boardroom table for a rising tech firm downtown. I used a design they'd told me was commercially unviable. The CEO loved it so much he posted it on his social media. His architect called us the next day. Word of mouth is a powerful thing in a world of slick marketing. We were authentic. We were craftsmen. We poured our souls into every piece. We took on the projects Vance & Sons had become too arrogant and complacent to handle. And we were growing. Every dollar we made was reinvested in better equipment, better materials, and better pay for our team. The warehouse started to feel less like a garage and more like a humming, thriving workshop. Then came the turning point. The Alida, a historic landmark hotel in Savannah, was undergoing a massive multi-million-dollar renovation. The contract to furnish its 173 guest rooms and suites was the most prestigious project on the East Coast that year. Vance & Sons was the heir presumptive. My father was on the board of the hospitality group that owned the hotel. Leo's bid, I heard through a contact, was arrogant, overpriced, and lazy, a rehash of their old designs with a modern veneer. They believed the contract was already theirs. They were wrong. This was our chance to move from the shadows onto the main stage. I called an all-hands meeting. "We are going to bid on the Alida contract," I announced. The room was silent. We were a tiny, unknown workshop. Bidding against Vance & Sons was like a rowboat challenging a battleship. "We can't win," Sarah said quietly. "They won't just outbid us, they'll crush us." "No," I replied, a cold certainty in my voice. "We're not going to outbid them. We're going to outthink them. We're going to outdesign them. We're going to show them what real vision looks like." I knew then that this wasn't just about a contract. It was the first real battle of the war, and I had no intention of losing. For the next 72 hours, the workshop became our war room. Sleep was a luxury we couldn't afford. Fueled by cheap coffee and sheer determination, we transformed my audacious plan into a concrete proposal. This wasn't just a bid, it was an experience. Sarah worked miracles, creating a fully immersive virtual reality presentation that would allow the hotel's board to walk through a fully furnished suite. It was the core of my original vision, executed with a level of artistry and technical skill that Leo, with his outsourced team, could never have achieved. Miguel and the other craftsmen created miniature, perfectly rendered physical samples of the key furniture pieces, allowing the board to feel the grain of the reclaimed Georgian oak, to touch the hand-stitched leather, to see the quality of the dovetail joints. My presentation didn't just focus on furniture. It focused on a story, the story of Savannah, woven into the very fabric of our designs. We flew to Savannah on a shoestring budget, all 5 of us crammed into a rented minivan. We were ushered into a grand boardroom, and I saw the barely concealed smirks on the faces of the board members as we set up our equipment. They were expecting a pitch from Vance & Sons, the industry titan. We were the obligatory token small business bid. Then I began. I didn't talk about costs and timelines. I talked about history and legacy. I handed them the VR headsets. One by one, their expressions shifted from skepticism to surprise, then to outright awe. They weren't looking at a catalog, they were standing inside a vision. When my time was up, the room was silent. The chairman of the board, a stern-looking man named Mr. Abernathy, took off his headset, his eyes wide. "In 30 years," he said slowly, "I have never seen a presentation like that." We won the contract that afternoon. The call came as we were driving back to Charleston, exhausted but electric with adrenaline. The news hit the Charleston business community like a shockwave. The unsinkable Vance & Sons had been beaten by a tiny, unknown startup run by the cast-off daughter. Leo's fury was immediate and predictable. Our primary supplier of rare hardwoods, a company Vance & Sons had on retainer for decades, suddenly canceled our accounts, citing unforeseen inventory issues. It was a transparent attempt to choke us off, to make it impossible for us to fulfill the Alita contract. But I had anticipated this. Months earlier, I had begun cultivating relationships with smaller, independent lumberyards in North Carolina and Tennessee, sources who were eager to work with a company that paid on time and treated them with respect. When Leo's blockade came, we barely missed a step. My brother's brute force tactics were a generation out of date. He was playing checkers. I was playing chess. His next move was uglier. The old rumors about my instability resurfaced, whispered at cocktail parties and charity galas. He started a smear campaign, painting me as a vindictive amateur who had gotten lucky. It backfired spectacularly. The story was too good to ignore. The narrative of the wronged daughter rising from the ashes was far more compelling than that of the entitled son lashing out. The editor of Architectural Digest, a woman I deeply admired, caught wind of the story. She flew to Charleston, not to see the opulent Vance & Sons showroom, but to visit our gritty warehouse. She spent a day with us, interviewing the artisans, watching us work. The feature she published wasn't just a review, it was a coronation. The headline read, "The Soul of Charleston: How Acanthus and Oak is Redefining American Craftsmanship." It celebrated our resilience, our vision, and our commitment to authenticity. It never mentioned Vance & Sons by name, which was the most damning insult of all. The Alita project was a resounding success, and with the profits and the prestige it brought, Acanthus and Oak exploded. We moved into a larger facility, hired more staff, and were inundated with commissions from across the country. We were no longer a small startup, we were a force. And with that power, I finally had the resources to set the final stage of my plan in motion. I hired a discreet but ruthless forensic accounting firm in Atlanta. I handed them Arthur's key and copies of the ledgers. Their report confirmed my worst fears and my greatest hopes. The evidence of fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement was overwhelming and irrefutable. I packaged their findings, along with Arthur's meticulous records, into 2 identical, anonymous parcels. One went to a bulldog investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal I had been cultivating as a source. The other went directly to the SEC's whistleblower office. The traps were set. The wires were tripped. All that was left was to choose the time and place for the public execution. And I knew exactly where it would be. NeoCon, the largest commercial design exposition in North America, held at the Mart in Chicago. It was the industry's biggest stage, and I was about to turn it into a slaughterhouse. The atmosphere at NeoCon was electric, a cacophony of ambition and commerce echoing through the cavernous halls of the Mart in Chicago. The Vance & Sons booth was exactly what I expected. An ostentatious, 2-story monument to their own ego, positioned in a prime location right by the main entrance. It was draped in black velvet and dripping with crystal chandeliers. At its center stood my father and Leo, holding court like feudal lords, accepting praise for their latest collection. A series of gaudy, uninspired pieces that felt 10 years out of date. They were the past, masquerading as the future. Across the main thoroughfare, the acanthus and oak booth was its polar opposite. We had spent a fraction of their budget, creating a space that was minimalist, open, and inviting. It was constructed from light oak and steel, designed to showcase the furniture, not the brand. There were no velvet ropes, no stuffy receptionists. Our artisans were there, standing beside their creations, proudly explaining their process to a steady stream of interested architects and designers. We were the quiet story in a room full of noise, and people were leaning in to listen. I watched my father from across the aisle. He saw me, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of something, unease, regret, crossed his face before being replaced by his usual mask of cold disdain. Leo just glared, his jaw tight with unconcealed hatred. They saw me as an annoyance, a gnat to be swatted away. They had no idea the tidal wave that was about to break over their heads. At 10 a.m., the time of our scheduled product reveal, a crowd began to gather at our booth. The buzz from the Architectural Digest article had made us the must-see underdog of the expo. I stepped onto a small platform. "Good morning," I began, my voice clear and steady through the microphone. "They say that great design should be invisible, but it should also be smart." On cue, Sarah tapped a tablet. The room beside me, designed as a luxury hotel suite, came to life. Lights brightened, a desk smoothly elevated to standing height, and a beautiful media console opened silently to reveal a screen. "This is the Acanthus Connect collection," I announced. "It's a seamless fusion of timeless craftsmanship and intuitive technology. It's the future of bespoke design." It was the full, uncompromised realization of my original vision. It was beautiful, functional, and revolutionary. The crowd surged forward, a palpable wave of excitement rippling through the expo hall. Buyers, journalists, and competitors pushed past the Vance & Sons booth, their eyes fixed on our display. I saw the blood drain from Leo's face. I saw the dawning horror in my father's eyes. They were being rendered irrelevant in real time. That's when my phone vibrated in my pocket. A single text from my lawyer in Atlanta. "Now." A moment later, a collective buzz filled the air as hundreds of phones lit up with a breaking news alert. I watched as people's gazes dropped from my collection to their screens. I saw eyebrows raise, then eyes widen in shock. Whispers turned into murmurs, and the murmurs spread like wildfire. People started looking up from their phones, not at my furniture, but at my father and brother. The headline from the Wall Street Journal was brutal and direct. "Heritage furniture giant Vance & Sons at center of SEC fraud investigation. Founders Alastair and Leo Vance face allegations of embezzlement and tax evasion." The public humiliation was absolute and instantaneous. The fawning admirers who had surrounded my father moments before began to melt away, creating a sudden, stark circle of isolation around him. A high-profile buyer who had been shaking Leo's hand abruptly dropped it and walked away without a word. My father's phone rang. I watched him answer it, his face turning a ghastly shade of gray. He stumbled back, leaning against one of his own overpriced credenzas for support. It was over. Their reputation, their legacy, their carefully constructed world of lies. All of it shattered into a million pieces in the middle of their own coronation. Leo, his face purple with rage, finally snapped. He lunged across the aisle toward me, screaming my name, his eyes wild with impotent fury. "You did this! You bitch!" Before he could get within 10 feet of me, Expo security had him by the arms, dragging him away as he thrashed and cursed, a pathetic, unraveling spectacle for the entire industry to see. I didn't flinch. I just stood there, calm and still, and watched them burn. Months later, I stood in the cavernous main workshop of my new headquarters. It was a beautiful building, filled with light and the hum of creation. It was also deeply familiar. I had bought it, along with all its equipment, for pennies on the dollar at a bankruptcy auction. The large, faded letters over the main door had been taken down just last week. The ghost of the name Vance & Sons was gone, replaced by the clean, sharp lines of the Acanthus and Oike logo. The place was alive again, filled with happy, well-paid artisans who were now partners in the company. I walked over to an old, scarred workbench in the corner, the one my grandfather had used. I ran my hand over its surface, my fingers tracing a deep gouge in the wood, a mark I'd made accidentally as a curious child, a mistake my grandfather had just laughed at. It was the only thing of theirs I had wanted to keep. The end.